Betsy Warland is a writer herself. She writes poetry, lyric prose, and essays. And she writes also critical essays on art. She's the co-founder of the Creative Nonfiction Collective and the director of the Writers' Studio at Simon Fraser University, and one of the members of the Vancouver Manuscript Intensive as well. So you can see lots of experience both doing her own writing and coaching and mentoring others in the writing process. Recently, she put a lot of that experience into the book, Breathing the Page, Reading the Act of Writing. And I had a chance to talk to Betsy Warland about this book, and I started by asking her about the title, which I found really lovely and really intriguing.
It's partly probably a reflection of my being a poet. Also, music's really very important to me, and I also have a meditation practice, and where one of the things you do is focus on the breath. And I talk about it in one of the essays how, and I think it's the one on the form of poetry, how it's like two lovers or married couple, whoever it is, in bed breathing each other's breath. And so that's the kind of relationship I think that a writer is best to have with a page, that there is that kind of intimacy and attentiveness and
a reciprocal kind of nature of things there too. Yeah. There were so many things as I was reading through. If you could see this book I've got of yours, I've got little corners turned down almost every second page.
Great.
A few of the concepts that I'd just like to pull out and talk about here. And one of them is the whole idea that you mentioned here about heartwood. And I think this is sort of just jumping off from what you've been saying about abandoning the concepts of what we think and sort of letting the narrative lead us, and then maybe reflecting later on what the heartwood is.
Yeah, the heartwood is it's very elusive. Basically, it's talking about the heartwood of a tree, which is literally dead by the time it's a tree, but it's what was germinated the whole tree, what the whole tree took form from. And so this is very true of writing. Often it takes us quite a while to realize what actually has motivated this particular piece of writing. Sometimes, if we're lucky, we realize this early on in the writing process, but often it takes a very long time. We're well into even more 2 or 3 or 4 drafts before we start to realize this is what the heartwood is. This is what necessitated this whole piece of writing, all these hundreds of hours often. And then it helps you when you understand what it is, and it's usually something very simple. It's not a theme. It's not a plot. It's not what theses are written on. It's actually very simple and visceral. Then you will know how to do the kind of revising you need to do and new writing you need to do and what you need to take away. But it is the pulse that has driven us to write the whole thing. One of the examples I think I use in the book is she refuses her own goodness. Something like that. Like, it took this writer a very, very long time in her poetry manuscript to realize what united it all underneath.
Right, because she had other ideas, like she thought this was about love, or it was about...
Yes.
But it would be hard work, though, to get to that point.
It is.
You'd have to really be determined to get there.
Yeah. Well, I more recently I've been talking about that the act of writing is kind of perverse, because, you have to start over again every time you go to the page. It's constantly humbling, but the other side of it is it's endlessly fascinating. And for me, writing is my teacher in every respect, spiritual to emotional to intellectual. It's my teacher, and I'm hooked. Even though I grumble, I'm hooked.
Well, you bring that rigor to it, and one of the things that you mention in here is that one of the dangers or one of the possible pitfalls is getting stuck in what you describe as the coma story.
Yes. It's a story that we tell again and again, and we learn this basically as children, and we learn it from how adults tell stories about us, or we learn it from how they have their own coma stories. We take a memory and we plug it into this formula, and we tell it the same way over and over again, no matter who we're talking to. Even it can go on for decades. You keep telling that story, right? Exactly the same way.
Telling it by rote.
Yes, telling it by rote. That works in a certain way because it's almost a shorthand, and usually we're telling it to people who can fill in the blanks, who know us, who have a similar common story, etc. But it does not work in writing, and it's often you'll see when a writer's not sure where they're going, and is trying to kind of get control of it, that the template of the Tacoma story will come down on the writing, and that's what just kind of makes it go dead. basically, and is perplexing to people. It's oversimplifying it, not allowing the story. It's not allowing it to go where it really is supposed to be going. It has to go.
And would you ever suggest just taking that out altogether?
Oh, yes. And I have this exercise where I have writers write a coma story. And I say, okay, now put a comma either before it starts, or if there's a comma in the middle of it somewhere, or change the period at the end of the coma story into a comma, and then puncture it and write into it. So what isn't in that coma story? Let that sort of push up to the surface and see what part of the narrative is being repressed or denied or avoided. And so once they've had that experience, that really helps them understand the power of recognizing it, the power of puncturing it, the power of having to remove it at some point. Maybe it helped us initially kind of get it down, but then you have to pull it off. It's a fun one. It's a fun concept, and it's actually really revelatory for a lot of writers.
This is my conversation with Betsy Warland. She is an author and director of the Writers' Studio at Simon Fraser University. We're talking about her latest book about writing. It's called Breathing the Page, Reading the Act of Writing. Another thing you mention in the course of Breathing the Page is this whole idea of active waiting, which I find fascinating. Can you talk a bit about this idea of active waiting?
I'd love to. It's so opposite of today's, everything has to be quick and fast and efficient and multitasking, et cetera, et cetera. It's really the opposite. There's a writer, Brenda Warland, who has written a very good book in the 1930s called If You Want to Write. She writes about this too, and she learns to moodle. That she used to start writing by drinking a lot of caffeine and smoking a lot. And eventually she started feeling this isn't quite satisfying, this isn't quite right. So she changed that into gradually going for a long walk before she started writing. And her writing changed. Her writing became much more satisfying and vital and, evocative. So active waiting is, I do this a lot. I will sit for a long time sometimes, and you're tempted by all these, you could write it this way, or this is a great line, or what about this image, or, but you can tell they don't have a quality of authenticity about them. They're just easy outs. So I really talk to writers about the importance of just sitting and waiting until it comes to you, waiting until you really have a receptivity and a curiosity to hear where it next needs to go, whatever you're writing, a poem or a novel, just to wait. And what's the feeling around that when it's the waiting is come to fruition? How do you know? It just has an energy to it. It surprises you. It may not shock you, but it surprises you. It pricks your own curiosity. You have a sort of excitement about it, and you really want to follow it. It's on the scent again, like Virginia Woolf. You can feel it. Because I could see that sort of feeling of, not panic, that's probably too strong, but distress starting to build the longer you sit, potentially, right? You're like, uh-oh. Yes, yeah. It's just something to learn how to do, and, the more you do it, the more you trust it, because you see the results. Other people see the results. They can tell the difference. Active waiting, and I like how you put in there, not to be confused with procrastination. That has a different feeling altogether. It does. Although I will say, I call about it, crossing the threshold from the rest of our life into writing, and that usually we have some methods for doing that, and that is really important to do, and we can confuse that with procrastination. It might be, going for a walk. It might be doing the dishes. It might be folding the laundry. It might be whatever, but it's some kind of activity that helps us approach that threshold and go into the realm of writing, and that is important. That is as important, I think, as the writing. If you don't trust and get to know how you have to cross the threshold, your different methods of doing that, then the writing is going to suffer. It's like a cue, like you were talking about earlier. If you're working as a visual artist, you're going possibly to a studio. You're taking a very different set of implements that you'd normally have in the run of a day. And it can look like you're doing nothing, to your intimates or whatever. Like, you might be sitting. I remember my father. We grew up on a farm. He would go out in the middle of the farmyard where all the buildings are around, and there's this yard in the middle, and he would stand there in the morning. He'd just stand in the middle of it for, 5-10 minutes. And my mother finally asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm just thinking through the day." So
Isn't
I guess
that lovely?
Yeah. So he's just standing out, looking at everything, and kind of thinking, what's the best way to sort of move through this day? Should we do first, second, to whatever, and what's kind of what we'll see when we get there if we do this or that. And so I think I partly learned this from him. Yeah.
Scaffolding.
Oh,
Tell me about scaffolding.
well, scaffolding is what we use to. It's literally taken from building a building. So you know how scaffolding is put up, particularly when you're doing stone or brick to build. But not only that. I mean, the scaffolding you see in the leaky condos that they have to put up. Same thing. So scaffolding is what you need to construct in order to do the initial building up of the narrative. So it's the way you ramp up to it. It's the way you buttress it. It's the way you warm up. It's the way you conceive of this kind of general structure that you're building as you're writing this narrative. Then we have to remove it later on. And that's hard because you get really attached to it, because it really helped you, build this thing. There can be some really good writing in scaffolding, right? But it is scaffolding. And so if you think about it, if you finally construct the building and you leave the scaffolding still there, it's a problem. It's obstructing, really, the impact and the overall kind of
beauty,
inherent logic and beauty of the building, right? And so you have to pull it away, and it can be excruciating initially. But once you start to identify it and recognize it, and again, you see the results of when you remove it and how people have a much more unimpeded entry into that narrative and feel it much more keenly and feel much more invited in, not having to kind of, sort of find their way through all these, boards and poles. You see that, again, this is what you have to do.
Can you think of an example from any writing of your own that would indicate or highlight that idea?
Yeah, one time, when I talk about it in the book, I had a poetic narrative. It goes back between prose pieces and poems, and I had 8 Buddhist sutras, which are like prayers, that I put in periodically through the writing of that, and they were in toward the very latter part of revising the manuscript. And they really helped me write that manuscript, because it was a difficult manuscript, and they really helped me focus as I went along. And eventually I had to remove all but one. And, it was like taking the jewels out of the crown. I really didn't want to do it. They meant so much to me. But they didn't mean that, they didn't have that same relevance for the reader. Ultimately, we have to think, what does the reader need and doesn't need? This is what then makes a piece of writing powerful and unforgettable.
Later on in the book, you talk about, and you've kind of alluded to this too, the idea of the relationship to the sheet. And you describe at one point how in some of your classes you hold up a blank sheet of paper and ask, what is this?
Yes.
And I was quite surprised by where you were going with that.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. I'm glad you asked me about that one. I always talk about the page whenever I teach. And I will take a piece of, I did this recently in Word on the Street. I did a 1-hour session, and I held up a blank sheet of paper, an 8.5 by 11. I said, what is this? And people start saying, well, it's a sheet of paper, it's this or that, and I say, yes, but what is it? And they get more kind of vexed as time goes on. Then I asked them to hold up, does anybody have a journal here? And it was very funny. We're in the street, like about 3/4 of the people pulled out journals, right?
Your pre-selected audience.
Yeah. Which reminded me of Woody Allen's film Annie Hall, when he's in a department store and he says, does anybody have a Valium? And everybody starts pulling it out of their purses and their pockets. So I said, so what's the difference between this sheet of paper and that journal? And I pointed at one. Then they started to get a little bit more aware, but still couldn't quite figure it out. And then I said, this is public space. An 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper is public space. And a journal is private space. And that's one thing we have to really take into account as writers, that we have to occupy that public space in ways we don't have to do it in a journal. And we have to also take our readers into account in ways we never think about in a journal. So they're very different, and it's really important to step up to the plate about that.
Betsy, thanks so much for coming in to talk about this. It's really great to see you.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to be talking with you. And great questions. And I'm maybe next time I see you, you'll say, hey, guess what, Betsy?
I'm waiting. I'm actively waiting.
Okay.
And of course, that last was from the fact that I told Betsy that once I read this book, I felt like, as I say, going and grabbing a pencil and starting to try writing.